You're listening to a Lutheran Conversation with your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lutheran Conversation. I am your host, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. So, a Lutheran Conversation is a show produced by the Order of Knight George. We're an Australian-based Lutheran media ministry, although we're more of a resource site. Basically, we have our YouTube channel, our SoundCloud, and our website, which you can find at www.knightgeorge.info. If you want to find the other content, just go on YouTube or SoundCloud or iTunes and search the Order of Knight George. We are basically a resource hub. We've got a lot of information there from the different Lutherans in Australia, not just the main Lutheran Synod or even just my synod, but a lot of the other micro synods as well in Australia. So if you want to check out any of that information, you can just go to those to our website or to YouTube or SoundCloud and check them out there. Now, for our Lutheran Conversation today, we have Pastor Phil Washiem. Pastor Phil, would you like to go? Do you want to go by Pastor Phil or Philip, or how would you like to be addressed?
Phil is fine.
All right. Well, we'll go on with our first question, which is, where are you serving? So, the congregation, where you're based, and the synod you belong to.
Right. So I belong to Lutheran Church of Canada. That's our synod. We're a confessional Lutheran synod here in Canada. I serve in Victoria, British Columbia, on Vancouver Island, and I serve at Redeemer Lutheran Church here.
Since you're the first pastor we've had from the Lutheran Church of Canada, can you just quick brief the listeners on what is the relationship between the Lutheran Church of Canada and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod?
We're actually a sister congregation, or maybe a daughter congregation might be more appropriate. Back in, I believe in 1988, or before 1988, when Lutheran Church of Canada became an independent church body, we were actually a district of the Missouri Synod before that. So we were part of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And in 1988, we became our own church body. We're still in full communion with one another. We have seminarians going to each other's seminaries. So yeah, there's a full communion between us.
I was going to say it's kind of like the Lutheran Church of New Zealand, but actually in reverse, because there was synodical bodies that had formed in New Zealand, and then they had entered into fellowship with what was then called the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, or ELCA, which was in fellowship with the Synodical Conference and thus Missouri Synod. And the group in New Zealand then decided that rather than continue as a separate synod, they actually just became the New Zealand district of the ELCA, and then later when the ELCA and the UELCA merged to form the new Lutheran Church of Australia, the Lutheran Church of New Zealand has still just remained it's just a district. So in New Zealand, I think they are registered as the LCNZ, like the Lutheran Church of New Zealand, but on the books, they're just a district of the Lutheran Church of Australia rather than a separate synod. I mean, kind of, you guys are a little bit like what happened in Papua New Guinea, whereas the churches that Australia established over there went and became their own synods rather than being like a Papua New Guinea district. But that's kind of a little bit different in the fact that those were more established missions that were kind of from the beginning were kind of intended to be a separate thing. They never were really much. They were never really a district of Australia. They were always intended to just be missions.
Yeah.
Cool. So
kind of like the missions we have in Vietnam and other places like
they're
that.
not like there's not like the Missouri Synod Vietnam district. It's like a whole separate mission.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, that's a little bit of fun history for the listeners. Moving on to the second question, which is a brief history of your faith life and journey. So, were you born a Lutheran? Did you convert to Lutheranism? How did you end up in Lutheran Church of Canada? How did you become a pastor? And where have you served since you've been a pastor? Try to keep it short, but...
Lifelong Lutheran with a pause in between. So I grew up in, my father was a sort of a, I guess, kind of a missionary in what at the time was the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, which is now the ELCIC, which is the other Lutheran Synod, the other main Lutheran Synod in Canada.
So are they connected with like the ELCA in America or not?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And at that time it was a more conservative, it was all Scandinavians. So LCC was German, the other was more Scandinavian. Anyways, after a while, we moved up to northern Alberta, which is where I'm really from. And there was only a Lutheran Church Canada congregation up there, so we became a member there. When I went to university, I went to non-denominational churches. My now wife and I, we just that was the thing to do, I guess. So we became pretty soon disillusioned with those churches, and then slowly worked our way back to Lutheran Church Canada. After I finished my undergrad.
It's like a prodigal son story.
Yeah. And my wife comes from the United Church in Canada, which would be Methodist Presbyterian.
Interesting. We have a church in Australia called the Uniting Church. They were a mixture of Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists.
Oh, so a similar kind of mix. Okay. So when we both finished our undergrads, we happened to move to Montreal, and my wife was doing a master's degree at McGill there. And after she was done, we weren't sure what we were going to do. Sorry, at that time, we actually went to an ELCIC congregation. I don't know what was going on there, but we decided to move on, and we joined a Lutheran Church Canada congregation. And then maybe a year or two after that, my wife was graduating, and we weren't sure what we were going to do. And I said, I think I'd like to go to seminary, because this is something that's always been niggling me at the back of my head. And so I applied to seminary in Lutheran Church Canada, was accepted, and graduated in 2002 and was sent to the island. So I've right out of seminary, this is my first and only parish here since 2000.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, it is somewhat nice when, pastors stay put rather than move around.
And it's more of the norm now than it was in the past, for sure.
I mean, there are advantages to it. There is also sometimes the disadvantage of creating like the idle pastors. So, for example, the church I grew up in my lifetime, we'd had probably about 4 or 5 different pastors when I was growing up there. But before that, the pastor we had serving there had served for over 40 years. Yeah. And so it had really much left that kind of pastor such and such had always done it this way. Especially when you're like 40 years, you've got like a whole like generation of kids that have baptized and are having their own kids baptized by the same guy. So
I'm getting to that point now. It's starting to get there. But I don't think you're right. That's an absolute, that can be a trap that happens. But
that's an interesting history. Moving on to then the third question, which is, what would you say is a controversial doctrine that you personally hold to? Now, this could be something that's controversial within your synod that maybe not everyone else in your synod holds to. Maybe it's something controversial within Lutheranism that the rest of the LCC agrees with you on it, but everyone else in North America is going to be mad at you. Or it could even be something that's just controversial that Lutherans hold to that other Christians might get cranky about. Basically, something that's going to annoy some people if you say, I believe X, and then someone's going to get offended.
Interesting. I just had this conversation with a colleague today. I'm going to have to put women's ordination out there. it really hasn't been talked about a lot here in Lutheran Church Canada, but it's definitely, you know, I'm actually, I have a Bible study, and I can't remember how it came up, but they said, yep, let's do it. So it's something that we just have to talk about, you know, in an open way, and say, here's the scripture and how that supports it. You know, I can see that being, I mean, more and more of an issue nowadays than it has been.
So just to clarify, where do you fall on the issue of women's ordination?
I follow the scriptures as we understand it in Lutheran Church Canada, that we do not ordain women.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Cool. So
that's my understanding. In everything I've read so far, that's where I am.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go through it again with my Bible study and see where we end up on that one. So,
well, I assumed the LCC was similar to Missouri and didn't ordain women.
Yeah.
So,
but I think we're coming to a point where we're starting to. I mean, it's too bad we haven't had this conversation sooner, because I think it builds a lot of distrust in the congregations when it isn't. I think we've always just seen it. Well, this is doctrine and we can't change it, and you know, but now we're talking about it more, maybe. So.
Problem is even if you do have the conversation, it can pop up again. Like in Australia here, they've been going on it for ages and ages. And actually, back in the 60s, when they formed the two church bodies, the ELCA and the UELCA, to form the Lutheran Church of Australia, their founding document, known as the Thesis of Agreement, I think it's 611, says that women can't be ordained. And so actual founding document. And that's because of that, it's what requires a 2/3 majority at Synodical Conference to change that. And so they've been arguing it, debating it. I don't know how early, maybe back then already. I know since the 90s it really became a really big point when they've started actually having the votes on it in Australia, and they've voted it on, I think it's 4 times in Australia so far, and they get over the 50% majority, but they can't quite reach the 2/3 majority.
Right.
Not last vote, the vote before, which was about 6 years ago or so, they missed out by, like, was it 12 people? So if 7 people had switched from against to for, it could have actually got through. Last vote, which was 3 years ago, they actually got an increased, like a higher number of people voting against it. However, I don't know if that was necessarily just more people are not wanting women pastors, but more so because at the earlier votes, they've just said, let's vote on whether women can be pastors, and then we'll work on writing a document for it. Whereas last time, the bishop commissioned the CTICR to go and write a paper supporting women's ordination, and then they were going to vote on that paper. And so I think there are people that may actually support women's ordination, but they didn't want this particular document to be the one that they subscribed to. Because I mean, I read through the paper, and there's a lot of problems with that paper. I wrote a little confutation on it, and one of the biggest issues I found with the LCA's, what's often called the DDS, or Draft Doctrinal Statement, is that they're trying to take all the different arguments for women's ordination and stick them together, but the problem is some of them conflict. So, like, there's the one when they say, it was just a time-bound command of Paul. But then another one, they say, Paul wasn't addressing all women. He was only, addressing those kind of domineering, controlling women. But the problem is the DDS put both of those arguments in there together. So if you're saying Paul was only addressing controlling women, and then Paul was only saying this for a certain time, you're now saying that, back then Paul was saying it was bad for women to be controlling, but now, since it was only a time-bound thing, women can now be controlling of men. I'm like, that's a logical conclusion when you stick those two together. Pick one argument or the other.
Interesting. No, and I mean, it just keeps popping up for me. But I was reading some documents recently, because I know that Australia has done some good documents, at least for discussion purposes. So I was drawing some of those out to look at them as well.
Well, the two big names on it would be Dr. John Kleinig and also Dr. Greg Lockwood. So both of those, I mean, other fellows like Dr. Greg Lockwood's son, Michael Lockwood, has also done a lot on it, but probably the two main people that have really written a lot on it, the big heavy hitters, would be Kleinig and Greg Lockwood. So they would be the big hitters, which is quite interesting because Pastor Greg's brother, Pastor Peter Lockwood, is actually one of the big hitters on the pro-women's ordination side. So you got these two brothers that stand on the opposite sides, which, what was interesting is because they were both lecturers at the seminary, and Greg Lockwood taught Greek and New Testament, and Peter Lockwood taught Hebrew and Old Testament. So they are like essentially mirror opposites of each other.
It'd be interesting to see why and where they came to their positions. Because
I did interview Greg on a podcast really early ago. People will be able to find it if they go to either SoundCloud or YouTube. It's it's actually titled like Women Pastors, and it's an interview with Greg Lockwood.
Okay.
And I can't remember if he mentioned it in the interview himself or if that was just something we were talking about afterwards. But he was pointing out that actually he's the oddball in his family. Like, I think he's one of like 7 siblings, and all the rest of his siblings are all pro women's ordination, and he kind of stands off as the oddball of the family that is actually against women's ordination. So how I have kind of 2 questions for you. One is how much of a push is there in the Lutheran Church of Canada for women's ordination? Like, is it like a few crazy pastors that may bring it up every now and again, or is it?
I don't know.
Talk much about?
There's not really. It's never come up at our synodical conferences because I think we deal with it a little differently. Maybe I don't think it's come up because we don't vote on doctrine. Like it would. I don't even know how that would come in Lutheran Church Canada. To be honest with you. I think it's more coming at the congregational level, and maybe it's just, maybe I'm not always in tune with everything that's going on out there, but I know we had a paper put out 10 years ago, maybe.
Okay.
Anyways, but it was just a discussion paper, and now it's used to just help us make decisions. They also released a Bible study, which is something I'm going to be using with my Bible study on this. So, I mean, we have papers by our CTCR. We have papers by them out on that sort of thing, and what roles women can serve in the congregation. Usually when they come out, there's a bit of kerfuffle about it. I know in that recent paper, there was a minority a disagreement to it, and it was published as well. So, and I'm, I want to, when we do talk about it, I want to make sure everyone gets to look at all the materials so they can at least, see the different positions on it. So,
I've got a number of questions going here. Just
okay,
first one was you mentioned that you said don't vote on doctrine. Now, I think even the LCA would argue that we don't vote on doctrine. The question for you guys then would be, so what the LCA does is they put forth like statements, and then the congregations, like the congregations send pastors and delegates to vote, and then they will vote on whether the synod will adopt that particular paper as their official position. Now this would work out well is if the idea was like in the old days when they had like the old Elka and new Elka and stuff like that, when they did this, and if you didn't subscribe to the new statement or whatever, then, well, too bad.
Yeah.
You're excommunicated from the synod. So, like, if the LCA said, okay, well, now we agree that a majority of us support women ordination, that's the official position of this bit of this organization, everybody either submit to it or get out.
Right.
That would be, more legitimate. Like at the Council of Nicaea, they did kind of have a vote on the homoousios or homoousios, and then it was kind of, well, if you weren't agreeing that Jesus was the same substance, then you were excommunicated from the churches.
Right. Whereas
we actually do get this weird thing where it's like, oh, well, we just vote on it, and then everybody still stays part of the same organization. It's like, then it's really just, well, which majority gets to decide what's the church's official statement, and there's going to be a whole bunch of people within that synod that don't agree with the actual statements of their own church.
Right.
Which is really what the LCA has. I mean, like, the LCA condemns millennialism and a bunch of stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of people in the LCA that actually teach it and support it and stuff like that. So,
well, I think we all have that. I mean, we all have that within our congregations, but I think people choose to remain. They don't see it as something that's gonna. They don't want to be isolated. They're not going to isolate themselves because of that. They're willing to hang out, still hang out, right? I'm trying to remember because I just was looking at this with Lutheran Church of Canada, and I think the CTCR documents are never. In our CTCR, the documents are accepted, but I don't think they become. They're never. They may reflect the official position, but they're not. They're more there to help in the discussion of that. So
that sounds similar to the. So in Australia, they do the CTICR is what they have. They will write recommendation documents and stuff like that, but it's only when they actually write an official DSTO or doctrinal statement and theological opinion that those are the things that get voted on, and when they get the however much majority they need, they're adopted as an official position.
Got it. Okay.
So, yeah, there's certain papers that the CTICR might write that people don't have to actually subscribe to.
Yeah.
But then if it's a DSTO, if you belong to the Lutheran Church of Australia, you're actually saying that you subscribe to these teachings, which was the whole reason that I ended up withdrawing from the LCA, because I just could not, like, the actual, in the ordination, right, you say that you will uphold all the teachings and practices of the Lutheran Church of Australia. I'm like, well, I don't agree with a number of these doctrinal statements, so what I can't belong to this church.
So what's the relation between you and maybe other Lutheran church groups in the world then?
So we're
like, I don't know how large your little group.
We're pretty small. The COAC is also very new, so we're in the process of getting there. So we officially only founded back in 2019, So after I had left the LCA, I joined a small little group called the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church. After an issue with them, it's kind of, the issue exactly was complicated. I normally say I was kicked out. I have talked to some of the members. They say, well, you're never actually officially kicked out. But I point out that I said, well, I was suspended from Holy Communion, and we never actually followed the official excommunication process. It kind of was I just stopped. Things were never done properly. So I was kicked out, I withdraw. It got messy. But essentially I approached a group called the OLCC, which is a small group that had been around since I think about 2006. I approached them right as they were having a little disagreement amongst themselves, and I sided with the pastors getting excommunicated from their group. So we then went and started the COEL now, and so we're a very small body. We're only newly formed. We're in the process of dialoguing with different little groups around to see if we can establish fellowship, but we're still in the process of talks. So we hold like, proper, like, strict closed communion. You have to establish ultra pulpit fellowship and all this. So we're just in the process of establishing fellowship with what groups we can. So pretty much we're still in talks is really the status of where we are. But we have established a few little house church plants overseas. So we've essentially, my question was, because I think Missouri Synod has deaconesses, and I'm not exactly sure what they can do. So does the LCC have deaconesses, and what can they do?
And I think we just refer them all as deacons. They're all just referred to as deacons, I think. I don't know how since we had Concordia University in Edmonton, which was one of our universities, which is no longer one of our universities, but deacons tended to be what were they called? Well, they were called deacons, but they tended to kind of do, they do the youth programs, maybe, and they could be men or women. Yeah, it was a bit, almost a little bit nebulous. Sometimes it was like an assistant, but not as in the service, but as in just other programs and things within the church.
I would say the co-elk ourselves, we take a very kind of more strict position as also leaving the office of word and sacrament to the pastor. So we don't have lay, they call them lay lectors. I like to make the distinction between lay readers and lectors. Like a lay reader is when those circumstances where a lay person is like kind of leading like a matin service or like a, service about communion. Whereas a lay lector is the one that can do the readings where the pastor will preach a sermon, but the lay person will read the Bible readings. We don't have lay lectors. We don't have lay people assisting in the Holy Communion. So only clergy will do that in our churches. So we won't have men or women doing. We allow deacons to do the kind of the other stuff in the church, things that aren't word and sacrament. So you can have acolytes helping carry stuff in possessions. Have people.
Right, and some of that depends on the congregation. I mean, if you have a small congregation, you kind of draw on who can help you when you can. They can help you, and for the. I mean, in our congregation, for the most part, I've done all the reading myself, and usually, if there are lay readers, they'll just be the epistles, and the pastor will read the gospel.
Yeah,
that's what I've usually seen if that happens, and usually. Most congregations I know, if there's anyone helping with communion, it's the elders.
And are they limited to men, or do they allow women to do that?
Usually, not that I'm aware of. How about that? I'll say not that I'm aware of.
So usually men.
I don't think it has yeah. Elders tend not to be, but it just depends on, like, the problem with a lot of these terms is different people have different understandings of those terms, right? I mean, elder is pastor. That was sort of the original meaning. So, and different congregations give them different names. Lay leaders or whatever they're called. And usually they're men. And they're the ones that tend to have help with communion, or are the elders. I always found it interesting in like the Roman Catholic Church that they have a huge, they've got multi-levels of this stuff, and there are women that do help with it. So I've always found that interesting. It'd be interesting to hear their rationale for that. But it's not something I've really looked into as far as distribution and stuff like that. So again, because we're in a small congregation, it tends to fall on me anyway. So we haven't had that discussion so much.
Question with that then, who would commune you though? Like, would you give yourself the communion?
I commune myself, and in our altar book, it tended to have, that was sort of suggestion, and I did present that to my elders, and they were like, that's actually, they were more comfortable with that in a lot of ways. So, because
I'd recommend people, this is a shameless plug, but I wrote a paper, and now it's a book on whether lay people should distribute Holy Communion. And what I found is often the earliest forms of it, which I seem to find only go back to about the 1930s, was never lay people distributing, like the pastor takes the bread and the lay person takes a cup. The earliest forms was the pastor would normally commune everyone, and then one particular lay elder would get up and commune the pastor. And like I found, that was the earliest practice I could find of that was the 1930s in Johann Fritz's Pastoral Theology. I can't see it appearing in anything prior to that. Often in the earlier books, like in the 1800s, their instructions were normally either A, the pastor gives himself communion, or the very strange, the pastor refrains from communion and he goes and gets another pastor to like commune him either during the week or something else. And I thought, see, I Okay, I guess that would be okay. I don't think it's good if the pastor gives communion to everybody else and then doesn't give himself anything. I mean, but then again, like, often, I mean, generally, unless there's some second pastor there, when the pastor does absolution, he doesn't absolve himself. He normally gives it to everybody else, and he has to go seek out another pastor if he wants absolution.
Right.
I can also see why the practice of refraining from communion begins.
Right. So there probably is no necessarily right or wrong on that. It just, what's the practice, you know? And
cool. Well,
did Jesus commune himself at the Last Supper?
that is an interesting question. I mean, he does say to the disciples that he's not going to partake of the cup again after this meal, so you'd assume that he did participate with them in this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you'd assume that. I mean, it never does. It just says he gave it to them and told them to eat it.
Exactly.
So it's speculation.
That's right. It's not about you and me, it's about everyone else.
It's probably somewhere in the second epistle of speculations or something.
Right, exactly. And there's no point in dying on that mound.
So we'll wrap up this with our fourth and final question, which is what do you think is the most crucial issue that needs to be fixed in modern Lutheranism?
That's an excellent question. I don't, what I've seen, like if I'm looking, I don't know about necessarily a huge crisis. I mean, there's always little things that we're always sharpening one another on, right? There's always little discussions, and these are good for churches, right? We need to have these discussions. What I find interesting, and I'm looking at the broader Christian church, is how in the last, let's say, 10 years, churches are becoming more and more polarized, right? We are kind of shaking ourselves out naturally, if you will. We're just going to either end of the spectrum, or however you want to say that. Well, we don't want to go too far on either end of the spectrum, but you know what I mean, right? Churches are splitting off, and I wonder how long that can go on. I mean, division in the church. I mean, it's always been there. How do we deal with that in a healthy way that allows us to keep conversing with one another? And obviously that you found something that you had to say, no, I have to go. And it was interesting reading when the North American Lutheran Church left the ELCA, how you get this discussion on why we're staying, why we're going, right? Like everyone had their reasons, and you couldn't really criticize any of them for that. And I guess looking at how those divisions damage the church, I mean, this is nothing new, right? Right, and that's probably the thing, is how do we continue preaching the message of forgiveness, which is the message of the church, right? That's what we do. How do we continue that in the light of all this?
I was going to say, as you're talking about, not so much polarization. I think even more so, there's this fracturing among Lutheranism that seems to be. Yeah. I mean, like, there's always been, like, you can look at early America, early Australia. There was always divisions within Lutheranism. They all were different synods, but there seems to be this. I don't know what it is. This, like, to a new extreme. So just to look at Australia, like I said, we've got like more than a dozen little groups in Australia now. This is the most we've ever had. Like before this, the next biggest peak of most synods in Australia was 8 synods, and that was back in the 1910s. But even with that, out of those 8 synods, 5 of them, so there was 2 of them were in a fellowship with each other, and another 3 were in fellowship with each other. So even though it was 8 separate synodical bodies, it was really only about 4 or 5 different fellowship groups. So even now we've got this nearly 15 different groups that none of them are in fellowship with each other, and it's like, what is it with the early 21st century where like there's this brand new complete fracturing breaking down of just everybody going their own way kind of.
Well, you can kind of see that as an influence of society, right? That's how everyone holds their own positions. There's no official truth, right? There's not one thing that, that kind of works for everyone. So we kind of pick and choose what we want. And if we find 3 other people that'll pick and choose the same things we want, well, we're going to go over there because that's better than what we have, or we perceive to be better than what we have over here. So in some ways, I admire the Roman Catholic Church, the way they've kept everyone bound together for so long. But even there, you can see it's starting to crack at the seams now. Yeah, like in this day and age, even that juggernaut's starting to show cracks. So
I mean, especially you got, all the controversy over Francis. You got to have, there's got to be somewhere where someone's going to call him an anti-pope and start
right.
Well, there already is the SSPX, whatever that stands for. They're a little like separate.
Oh, is that the one in Germany?
They're all over the place because I know there's a SSPX congregations in Australia and America. So
okay.
They're kind of they're Tridentine Catholics still. So like anything Vatican II is heresy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no. I was just reading recently. There's a group of German bishops that are ordaining women and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, check that out. That was an interesting read. I was like, oh, okay, that's new. So, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you can see it's affecting every Christian body in the world, and I think that's probably the big thing. And I might be wrong about that, but that seems to me something I've noticed in the last 10 years is just, good golly.
I guess also one thing I would point at that, though, was sometimes you got to avoid the issue, though, on the other side of, unionism, like this idea of unity for the sake of unity. Because I know, for example, that like there's all these pastors in the LCA that are like, oh, we all object to women's ordination, and so if women's ordination comes in, we'll all break off and form a synod. And I go, big problem is, all you guys might agree that women can't be pastors, but I know that, you're a six-day creationist, you're an evolutionist, you don't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, you're really high church, you're really low church, you support this or that. And like, you guys may all agree that women can't be pastors, but if that's the only thing that's going to unite your synod, you're going to end up fighting again five years down the road over, I don't know, creation, evolution, or whatever the next issue is going to be. And then there'll just be splinter after splinter.
And that's the thing. Right, that's the thing is where does that solid core end and where do the outer things, it's some of those outer things you kind of go, well, these kind of things are, we can keep talking about these things. They're not things that should divide us. What are those core essential things, right? And then we go to the confessions and look at those and go, oh yeah, that's a definite keeper, right? And so, I mean, there's so many things that have come up in this day and age that we just hadn't thought about before. Or just weren't an issue, maybe. There
also, I don't want to put too much on kind of a big figure, like, but often throughout history there is always kind of, you got your Augustines, you've got your Luther, you got your Chemnitz. There's this one figure that kind of jumps up, and whether he's just got charisma or he's just really good at explaining things, really everybody just goes, he's right, I can't disagree with him. And you get this big following.
Yeah.
And then often what happens is unless you can get a big figure like that to follow him, I mean, like, you look, Luther died and Lutherans started fighting, and was it the fact that Chemnitz was the next big figure that everyone's like, oh, well, he fixed it. And we don't really kind of have anyone at the moment that's like, there's... Yeah, Like I hear people talk about like you hear the names that get bantied around a lot, like, oh, there's Brian Wolfmueller or Jonathan Fisk, or these are really good people. I'm like, yeah, but it's not like Wolfmueller is like everyone in Missouri is like, boom, we all agree with Wolfmueller, and everyone starts like coming, all these churches like the AALC and NELC and all these go, oh, we all agree with Wolfmueller, let's all go join Wolfmueller's church. It's like, he's not Luther. I mean, he's a good theologian. Yeah. I like a lot of what he says, but he's not someone that can pull everyone together like Luther could.
No, and you're right. And I know I fought that before too is, where is that figure in the 21st century, right? We haven't had them come up yet. You're right. And maybe that time is right, coming soon, we'll see.
Maybe Philip Washiem. When we start the Washemite
Church. When just before, let's see, I think it was my second year of seminary, one of my professors said to me, "You've entered the ministry at a very interesting time." Yeah, it's, when someone says that to you, it's like, oh boy. So there's never a dull moment, I guess, but.
Well, we might as well wrap up here, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed the conversation. I mean, we've kind of got off on tangents and covered quite a lot of stuff, but then that's generally the idea of this. It's a Lutheran conversation. We're not picking one particular topic to stay on. I've got the 4 base questions to kind of guide the conversation, but then wherever it goes. Thanks. So thank you, Pastor Phil, for coming on, and hope the listeners have enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and it's nice to see you face to face this time.
Cheers.
All right,
goodbye, and God bless.
You as well.